Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 5,000 watt Husky generator. It is powered by a 9-horse Subaru engine, and although the engine appears to be in pretty good shape, the generator frame is not. I would say this spent a lot of time outdoors. That said though, the price was right. I was actually at the seller's buying another machine, and he threw this one in for only 50 bucks. And at that price, you cannot go wrong. So, the only thing I've done so far is pull the engine over, and the engine rotates and actually has very good compression. So the engine should run. I guess the question is, will it run and will it make power? So that is what we're going to find out today. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. So first things first, let's check the oil, make sure it has some. And yeah, actually the oil is filled right to the top. It is nice and clean. So that is surprising. So maybe the machine runs. So let's take a look in here. This machine uses a foam filter, and they tend to degrade over time, and they turn to dust. So this one does have a filter, and yeah, it's not in terrible shape, but you can tell it is kind of disintegrating. So for now, we'll get that out of the way, but it's good that it's nice and clean in here, and we don't have any critter nest. So I'm thinking I'm going to give this machine the benefit of the doubt. The air filter is clean, the oil is clean, and the throttle plate, it's not stuck. So let's leave it as is. We'll turn the fuel on, turn the choke on, and we'll try to start it. All right, let's give this a try. I do have a light plugged in and turned on in the event that it actually starts. But for 50 bucks, I'm not expecting it to run. And the recoil isn't working too well. And no, we get no signs of life. And yeah, we have no signs of life from this engine. So, likely it is a fuel problem, potentially spark. And yes, I did check the tank. The tank does have fuel in it. And the fuel actually doesn't smell bad. So I don't think that is the issue. So let's get the airbox off. That'll give us access to the fuel line. I want to make sure the fuel flow is good from the tank. And these gaskets for the Subaru pretty much always tear. Oh, it looks like we got lucky. The Airbox one came off clean. So no fuel came out of the line. So let's turn the fuel valve on. Interesting. We don't have any fuel flow, so that is definitely a problem. Potentially the carb might work. So let's pull the drain from the carb, see if there's anything in there. That's a good sign. These Mikuni carbs, they have a very small drain bolt, and a lot of times they break off because they get so rusted or corroded in place. And yeah, that's not too promising. The fuel that's coming out looks pretty old, but at least it's coming out. You can see too, there's a bunch of varnish on the drain bolts. So yeah, likely the carb is not gonna run the engine, but let's feed it a little bit of fresh fuel and see if it shows any signs of life. That's a good sign. The carb is accepting fuel. So the needle, if it is stuck, it's at least stuck open. And hopefully that slows down sooner. We're going to be flooding over in a minute. And we're slowing down. And we're just about stopped. So the needle and seat, they're actually working. And now the bowl is full of fresh fuel. So let's secure the carb again and try to start it. All right, let's try this again. Ignition's on, choke's on, and the carb is fueled up. Okay, I'll take it. So the engine, it does sound good, and the generator is making power. So everything that needs to work here is working. We just have a fuel delivery problem. Actually, two problems. First, we're not getting any fuel from the tank, and the carburetor is not delivering fuel properly to the engine. So both of those problems we need to sort out. I also noticed a bit of debris flying out as well. So it's possible we also have a critter nest in the blower housing. So we should take that off and have a look just to make sure. So for now, I'm just going to get the tank out of the way. We'll circle back on this later once the engine is up and running reliably. I'm going to get this piece off as well. There's only one bolt on each side holding it on. Likely I'm going to paint it up once we get the engine running right. And I also noticed the tank, although it had fuel in it, it didn't have as much as I thought. So potentially that might be an easy fix. It's kind of surprising, actually, too, given the amount of rust on some of these pieces that, the parts that commonly rust, like this heat shield and the exhaust and even the stator cover, are absolutely spotless. So let's not get too carried away here with cleaning, because although the engine sounds good and the generator makes power, the carb for this machine, the OEM one, is extremely expensive. And there are clone options, but they run the engine pretty poorly. So, I would say buying a new OEM carb at I think close to $300 is not really an option here. So hopefully this one isn't in too bad a shape. I think we're loose. It's just the gasket holding us back, I think. There we go. All right, so let's get the carb drained. Definitely a few chunks came out of there, so the bowl probably isn't going to be in great shape. Looks like we might need a 12 millimeter to pull that off. Actually, it's held on with a 13. Yeah, similar to the drain bolt. A little bit of varnish or rust. Yeah, a lot of debris, but the bowl is actually in good shape. You know, that stuff's going to clean right out of there. Not sure what it is, but might be fuel stabilizer potentially. And we've got some more of it right here. But the actual carb body looks to be in really good shape. So let's see if the main jet is going to come out, although I'm going to get a better fitting screwdriver for that. No, that is stuck. Don't want to force it. Let's see if we can get the pin out. And on these Mikunis, the pin is a pretty tight fit. And you have to be very careful because these legs are thin and they break off quite easily. And sometimes the pin only comes out one way, although this one, I think it can come out either way. There we go. Still not coming out, and we're so close. Let me try a little punch, and we'll tap that very lightly. Yeah, I don't think it moved at all. And it's right there on the edge. There we go. And yeah, the float, don't think it's going to come off with the main jet in there. But we can probably get the needle out. There we go. So we'll come back to this. The only thing left we can remove here is the pilot jet. And that jet, it's not threaded. It's just pushed in place with an O-ring. And this little retainer here keeps it in place. So we need to remove that screw, and then we can pull the pilot jet out. There we go. And I think that's it for now. I'm going to give this kind of a pre-soak to free up that main jet. And once we get that out, go through all the passages and just make sure they're clean. So the carb cleaned up pretty well in the 5-minute pre-soak. And more importantly, the main jet, it came out. And it actually was not clogged. So, the fact that the carb wasn't really running, I don't think was due to the jet, but more all the debris that was in the bowl. It was just getting in the way and likely preventing fuel from going up the throat of the carb. So I am tempted to just put this back together. I think it would run in its current condition, but these carbs, even when they are spotless inside, they do run lean. And I'd say about half of them surge, even after extensive cleaning. So, I think we do need to spend just a little bit of extra time, make sure all the passages are clear. And I'll give this another 5-minute soak, and then we'll put it together and try it out. And there are some very small passages here in the throat of the carburetor which make up the pilot system. So there's one that's in front of the throttle plate, and then there's a few more right behind the plate. So that is the pilot circuit or the idle circuit. And that is the main circuit that's in play when the engine's not under load. And that is the circuit that runs lean. So, if it does end up surging, we might need to drill out the pilot jet, which I don't like doing on these carbs because a lot of times, especially on that jet, I'd say about half the time the drill bit just gets stuck and breaks. So that is kind of my last choice. So hopefully we don't need to do that in this case. All right, so let's get the carb back together, starting with this pilot jet. So you do want to make sure it goes all the way down. So I just use a screwdriver and push and turn until it's fully seated. And then we need the little lock plate which goes on top. So that goes in the groove like that. And then we secure it with the screw. Okay, and then the pin, which It does only go in one way. And hopefully it goes in a little better than it came out. There we go. And actually the bowl gasket came out in the ultrasonic, so we'll try to get that in. It's usually easier to do before putting the float in. So we might need to backtrack a little bit here. Although that seemed to work out. Okay, let's try it out. So before we get the carb back on, let's just get the blower housing off real quick and make sure we don't have a critter back there. It actually looks pretty good back here. So no critter nest, cooling fins, they are nice and clear. So we can put that blower housing back in place. So I've got the blower housing cleaned up and reinstalled. The gasket here between the carb and the insulator, that did not survive. So I've already cleaned it off the carb body. And we just need to get this piece off the insulator. We'll put a new one on. And then bolt the carb down. And the washers are actually digging into the gasket, so yeah, looks like we'll be replacing that one too. Let's try this again. Same test as last time. The only difference is that the carb is nice and clean, so it should run. And I guess the question is, how well? So let's try starting it and find out. Okay, good. Started first pull, could turn the choke off fully, and the engine ran nice and smooth. As far as the voltage and the speed go, they're both a little bit low. The voltage was 116 volts. Ideally that would be 120 or slightly above. So we will make an adjustment there. And same thing with the engine speed. We do need a little bit of extra speed without a load. It should be at about 61.5 hertz. So there is an adjustment here, and there is a lock nut, so we will break that free, get it restarted, and set that speed. So the adjustment's been made. We're now at 61.5 hertz without a load, and that is pretty much perfect. And there is plenty of adjustment left if it needs to be adjusted in the future. And that is something you do need to keep an eye on these Subaru engines. This governor spring, it's fairly thin metal, and as they age and rust, they do lose some of their spring tension, and you get to a point where you max out the adjustment and you can't get the speed that you need. So in this case, we're fine. So let's turn our attention to the generator. We'll get the end cover off, get the AVR out, and make that voltage adjustment. These bolts look a little bit angry, and this one's actually backed out a little. So I'm not sure if that's a good sign or a bad sign. Interesting. So in the bottom of the cover was this crusty, rusty bolt. And it looks like it goes right there to hold the AVR in place. So I'm not sure why that's missing, if it just vibrated out. I mean, clearly, I'd say it's been some time since it was in the spot that it belongs. So I guess half the job is done. We only have the one bolt below to free up the AVR. Yeah, I think someone's definitely been in here at some point. There's usually a zip tie right there, fastened and held in place by a bolt, which is missing. That holds these wires in place for the AVR. And without that, these can fall in kind of like they are right now. And if they go too far in, they actually get caught up on the rotor. And, well, that's pretty much the end of your generator. So we will need to secure those better, although I say that, and there is actually a zip tie in there, so it's a little bit unorthodox how this is being held in place, but it is better than nothing. And this is the guy we're after right here. So usually one full turn clockwise will give you 2 volts. And in this case, we're short by 3 volts. So I'm thinking, let's give it 2 turns if I can get this screwdriver in there. There we go. Half, 1, 1.5, 2. So let's try that out and see what that got us. Yeah, well, that didn't go as planned. I'm sure you could hear the noise. When I started the engine, that noise was very loud and coming from the generator side of things. So I checked the kilowatt real quick and saw we were at 162 volts. So that little adjustment didn't go as planned. So I'm going to back the AVR up 1.5 turns. We'll get it restarted and see if the voltage is in a better range. So I would say 95% of the generators I test, one turn is 2 volts. But sometimes that is not the case. And also sometimes the wiper is dirty, so just moving it and setting it exactly back where it was makes a difference. So there, we're backed up 1.5 turns. Let's see what that does. So it came down some, but it's still way too high. And I think if we back it up just 1/2 turn, that's going to put us back to where we started. But I don't think that's going to be enough. So the wiper, I'm guessing, was dirty. So I'm actually going to do 1.5 turns back. So now we're actually 1 full turn less than where we started. So we overshot the other way. We're now at about 115 volts. So with this potentiometer, it seems like 1/2 turn is about 10 volts. So seems like we want to turn it clockwise about 1/4 turn. And that's actually a touch beyond. So I think that should be good. Let's try that. And that did it. So we're actually turned back a little bit from where we started. So you would think the voltage would be lower than the starting point. But in this case, you know, that wiper must have been a little dirty because we're now at about 121.6 volts, which is good. So the voltage is good. The engine speed is good. Really, the biggest outstanding thing here now is the tank, which I have a feeling it was just underfilled. So before dealing with that, I'm thinking, let's roll this outside. I do want to clean these rails off a bit. They are just covered in oil. Then we'll get it back in and we'll finish it up with the tank. So for some reason, there is a bunch of black overspray right here. So I'm going to try a bit of goof off to remove it. Likely it is going to remove the red as well. But, I'm likely going to end up painting this anyway, so I'm not sure it's going to matter a whole lot. So it is cleaning up pretty well. And the frame, although rusted, it's not terrible, at least in most spots. I think the biggest issue is right here on the control panel side of things. So I'm going to get this off. I'm going to sand it up, clean it up, get some fresh paint on it. And I'm going to do the same, I think, for the other piece that I pulled off earlier that goes right over here. So we get those parts cleaned up, and then we can start getting this back together. It's amazing the difference it makes. Just a little bit of paint I had hanging around, cleaned that up quite a bit. The engine cleaned up pretty well. And the control panel side is pretty good. Not perfect. There was actually quite a bit of pitting down here. You can just kind of see it. And there was a little bit of rot as well. So yeah, this machine, it's definitely seen better days, but it does still run and actually run quite well. So it is worth spending a little time to freshen it up a bit. Anyway, let's finish this thing up. We do need to get the airbox back on. I do have a new air filter, and we'll get the generator side closed up. And then we'll take a look at the tank. I have a feeling that it works fine if we just add a little bit of fuel. So I was just getting ready to get the airbox back on. I did get a new filter for it. And then I remembered the gasket, it was damaged. So I thought I had more of these, but I actually don't. So we're going to have to make one. So I'm going to cut out just a bit of gasket material, and we will try to get one that resembles this. Now, this gasket is a little bit odd in that there is a cutout down here, which doesn't seem to serve any purpose, and it also extends maybe a little bit further than it needs to past the choke plate. But there is plenty of surface area here to work with. So, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to make a seal. So that is what we're going to aim for. So this is actually a clone carb. It's not the carb that's on the machine. This carb runs the engine pretty poorly because it is a clone, but it does still serve a purpose in that we can steal parts from it or, use it as a template to make a gasket. So I'm going to notch these two areas out a bit to accommodate those ports right there. All right, that is pretty good. And I'm going to use a ball peen hammer just to tap kind of where the holes are for the studs. Then we can punch those out. Yeah, that'll do. So the outer shape doesn't really matter, but we do have this one that we can use to get kind of a rough idea of how it should look. I think that'll do. So we do need to oil this. Subaru actually calls for a mix of oil and diesel. But most say oil is just fine. So that is what I'm going to go with here. So getting this airbox on, it's a bit of a challenge because they really put this rail too close. But it'll go on. You just got to fight with it for a while. I think it'll go on. It came off. I'm noticing this boot is pretty destroyed. So I have a replacement for it. I guess the only catch is we do need to, disconnect all these wires to slip this old broken boot off and get the new one in its place. And before this is disconnected, just take note of the wires. We have these two white wires coming out of the stator. Those are commoned up. So that is the neutral. And we also have a jumper over to ground. So that confirms that the white wires are neutral. And then we have two black wires coming out of the stator. That's leg 1 and leg 2. Those are the live wires. And then we have two black wires going up to the control panel. So those can be flip-flopped. It doesn't really matter. But what's important here is that the white stays together. Yeah, some of these are down a little bit too far. You can see that one, might get pinched. So I'm going to cut that one back. The rest look pretty good. But this is kind of a common problem on these generators. Not this model in particular, but pretty much all generators made. This shrink tubing is just too far down. Did I just do that? Yeah, don't put the ground with the live. I'm not sure if I had the video rolling, but I just secured with a zip tie this connector right here, so it's not in danger of getting pulled in and damaging that stator or the rotor. So I'm pretty sure the no fuel situation was due to user error. There was not enough fuel in the tank, so let's just test it now that we've added fuel. And we still get nothing. So it was not user error. There is something wrong. I guess the question is it the line or is it the valve? So I guess let's get the line off, see if that changes anything. And it's best to cut this line off carefully. There is a rubber bushing that holds this in the tank. Now, the bushing's in good shape, but even so, if you pull on this too hard, you're going to pull this valve right out of the tank. And the line, it's on there pretty good, so you don't want to pull it, or you're going to have a problem on your hands. All right, let's try this. Okay. And we have good fuel flow, so the issue, thankfully, is not with the valve. It's with the fuel line that was on there. So we've got a new fuel line and filter going on. Well, oddly enough, I just blew through this with some air, and the air passed right through it. So the clog was just barely a clog. It is clear now. You know, regardless, we're not going to have a reoccurrence of that issue now that we have a new line and filter. And I also just siphoned out the tank entirely. I didn't like the color of the fuel that was coming out, so now we have 100% fresh fuel. The only other thing I want to deal with is the oil. You know, although it looked good, I have no idea how long it's been in there, what quality of oil is in there, or even if it's the right weight. So we're going to get that oil drained out. We'll start fresh with some known good oil, and then we'll roll this thing outside and put it to the test. All right, I think we're pretty much ready to go. We're fueled up and connected to the load bank. So I'm going to get the engine started. You know, while it's warming up, we'll double check the output. We use the amp probe to measure the total harmonic distortion and the oscilloscope to take a look at the sine wave. And we also have the kilowatt to measure the frequency and the voltage. So assuming everything's good, you know, we'll put on a half load of 2,500 watts. You know, we'll double check the outputs, and then we'll go for the max of 5,000 watts. Alright, so no issues at all getting the machine started. It did let out a puff of smoke, but that is pretty typical on these Subaru engines, and this one was no exception. Anyway, without a load, the THD isn't that bad. We're starting at about 5%, and the sine wave looks fairly typical. So let's put on a half load at 2,500 watts. We'll start with 2,000. No issues. We'll add 500. Everything looks normal. And the THD did come up a bit. We're at 11.6%. And the sine wave cleaned up a bit. So let's give this a few minutes, and then we'll go for the max of 5,000 watts. No issues at all at half load. So let's go for the max. And I'm going to proceed cautiously because this engine, you know, 5,000 watts, that is the best I've really gotten out of one of these. You really can't go much higher than that. So I don't want to stall it with the load bank attached. So let's bring it up to 3,000 watts. No problems. About 4,000, doing it just fine. 4,500, 5,000 watts, but you can see we're out of power. We're at about 56 Hertz, and yeah, I don't trust that. So 4,500 watts it can definitely do. It can probably do 4,800, but 5,000 it can't. Although to be fair, the fans in here are about 150 watts, so maybe it could do 5,000 if those fans weren't there. Anyway, at 4,500 watts, THD isn't terrible. It's at 13.8%, and the sine wave looks pretty much unchanged. So give it a few minutes, make sure there's no surprises, and then we'll shut it down. Alright, so no issues at all pulling the 4,500 watts. I am tempted, now that it's warmed up a bit, to try 5,000 again. And no, it just doesn't have enough horsepower. So let's take the load off. We'll let the load bank in the engine cool down, and then we'll shut it down. Well, guys, I think that's pretty much it. You know, going into this load test, I knew 5,000 watts would be best case scenario. And for a minute there, I thought we fell short. But I forgot to factor in the light. That was 100 watts right there. And an additional 150 watts with the cooling fan. So what I was saying was 5,000 watts. Technically, that was an overload of 250 watts, which doesn't sound like a lot. But for this engine, it is. You know, it was out of horsepower, and it just can't do more than 5,000 watts. Anyway, at the end of the day, you know, this didn't take a whole lot to get back up and running again. Really, the biggest concern was the carburetor. The OEM carbs, they are still available, but they are quite expensive, and the clones don't run it well. So thankfully, that carb came around without too much effort, and we cleaned up the machine, and now it is running well and looking good. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.